Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Special Counsel Robert Mueller has cleared Donald Trump and his campaign of allegations that they colluded with Russia to win the 2016 U.S. elections. Half of all Americans still believe that there was some form of collusion. However, Mueller has not been able to concretely conclude the question of whether Trump obstructed justice, leaving that unanswered. Former FBI Director James Comey, who had a famous falling out with Trump, has questioned Mueller's lack of decisiveness in that regard. All right, well, our guests joining us for this discussion are Dr. Frank Malls, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland in Australia. He's joining us now from Queensland itself. We're also joined by Mr. Paul Krishnamurty, who is a political analyst, and he is joining us now from Manchester in the UK. Paul and Frank, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Let me start with you, if I may, Paul. A complete exoneration, that, of course, according to President Donald Trump. Do you agree with him?
Not in the least. I think it's just a typical Trump diversion tactic. If we look at what's really happened here, we've seen a 4-page summary which only includes partial sentences at best from Robert Mueller, right? That proves that there was extensive Russian interference in the election on Donald Trump's behalf. The indictments that he's already laid out show that. And merely it just shows that Robert Mueller wasn't able to prove there was a high enough criminal bar to press charges. It doesn't in any sense clear Trump, and he isn't out of the woods. This is just the start of it. Interesting.
Frank, do you agree with that?
Group of people in the US who were hoping to find a smoking gun, and clearly that wasn't delivered. So I think Paul is right to say that there was clearly the bar was high. That it was clearly that the evidence was not high enough.
Okay, so Frank, if I may, I'll just stick with you. What do you make of this then? This question of obstruction of justice. Mueller did not give a final decision on that, and that seems to be creating some controversy right now. We know of Comey's opinion on that, saying it doesn't really make sense. Why didn't Mueller pass judgment on that? What do you make of that?
I understand why he came to this decision, because I think you want to err on the safe side. If you really don't have a smoking gun in its circumstantial evidence, it could actually backfire. To come out with something that isn't really meeting the bar, as Paul put it, it really will backfire, because people will then really call it a witch hunt and say, see, this was just a skew, this was just bias, this was just a witch hunt and an attempt to take Trump down, come what may, regardless whether the evidence was flimsy or not. So I think from that perspective, even though large numbers of Americans would be disappointed, people who supported Hillary Clinton and are still unhappy about the way that Donald Trump came to power, will of course be disappointed. But I think that upon reflection, most people will probably agree that that this is an understandable verdict. And that perhaps the bigger story here, what really is worrying, is the fact that there was Russian interference, where Trump's role, in a sense, is also not that important. If we look at it as a political scientist, if I look at it as a political scientist, I think the real worrying thing here is that these attempts have taken place. And as far as I can tell, this is not history. These are things that we can expect more of, right? We have seen Cambridge Analytica in the United Kingdom also unduly influencing the referendum results with the Brexit campaign. So I think that perhaps is the bigger story. Plus, of course, the more psychological, the political psychology of what happens to people backing Trump, people who detractors from Trump, how they will actually respond to this. But that's more a psychological story.
Frank, I wonder, though, isn't that just down to the structure of modern democracy? We do have lobbyists. We do have many countries around the world, not just Russia, who try to, in some way or another, lobby behind the scenes, of course, in their own ways, sometimes obviously using financial means as well, to get their way, to get their candidate into office so that they can benefit during their tenure.
That's right. I'm glad that you say that, because I think we could point fingers to Russia, but I think the United States will have some dirt on its fingers, as it were, right? I mean, all the great powers are now very interested in how we can use algorithms online on social media to influence public opinion. And that is, of course, something that goes back centuries or, well, decades at least, right? Where the idea of if you control the narrative, then elections become secondary, right? If we already use social media to group people together, to set the scene, to rev up emotions about X, Y, or Z, but that is actually how democratic decisions can be influenced. So it turns democracy, as you say, it undermines democracy, which is based on this idea that we get information, good quality information, people make up their minds, we get a clear process, a transparent process. Those things are clearly under threat.
All right, so Paul, what do you make of that discussion I was just having with Frank about modern democracy? Do you think that in this specific case, just if I may for a moment play devil's advocate, Trump says, this was a witch hunt. Why do you think it is that Russia is being picked on at this time? Is it being made a boogeyman? Do you think that other countries that also lobby U.S. presidential candidates should also be held to account?
Oh, well, I think it's a different question between lobbying and interfering with election and propaganda. So absolutely, I think that's a really illuminating discussion there. We don't get a lot of that in Britain where we talk about the state of democracy and lobbying and such forth. In this case, though, Trump, sure, is a symptom of a wider problem of totally anarchic, hidden, dark money in American politics, right? But the issue here is less that, which we already knew went on, which was already an issue, than the fact that there's one specific state in the Western world or in the world that is trying to blow up other countries' democracies. This isn't an American problem. In Britain, they influenced the Brexit vote. In France, they bankroll Marine Le Pen, and they are clearly ramping up the Gilets jaunes movement. In Germany, all of the political parties have been hacked, with the exception of the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right. So we're seeing exactly the same process. They hack, they use that to blackmail, to spread fake news and propaganda, to fix elections. Now, as far as I'm aware, in the modern democratic world, no Western country's ever done that.
Well, if I may come in, Paul, just for a moment, because in fact, I imagine many people would say that is sort of the opposite, isn't it? Like, I don't know. We can talk about many, military interventions, obviously. I'm not talking about necessarily election, involvement, but even that possibly can be argued in places like Latin America as well. So, there is a history there, isn't there, of Western intervention through different means, of course, across the world. And then many people, again, I'm just playing devil's advocate, would argue that this is in some way payback.
Oh, look, I understand that. I can absolutely understand that. And I wouldn't in any sense clear the West of doing of all sorts of skullduggery with democracy, with military interventions, with puppet leaders, etc., etc. But this is somewhat different in that, in the West at least, we have no history of this. Britain and America and France and Germany, we do not have a history of a foreign power intervening in this way, right? And I think the problem is really that the bigger problem is that we are locked in the old world of nation states. So people in the UK think that UK politics is being driven by UK actors, right? American, and it's specific to them. Same in France, same in America. In fact, this is about transnational organised crime. The people who Mueller is going to expose, and has already exposed, is effectively a 30, 40-year takeover by transnational organised crime of various situations. I don't think that there's any evidence that the Russian government acts on behalf of the Russian people.
Okay,
this is the fallout in the communist.
Sure. I wanted to get Frank in on this conversation. Frank, what do you what we've discussed so far vis-a-vis the fact that, again, on the flip side, as I had put to Paul, that it can be argued that Western intervention around the world has not helped democracy either?
If we look back at the Cold War wars, for example, there were a lot of what they call PSYOPs operation, both coming from the USSR as well as from the United States, trying to influence public opinion, infiltrating movements, say the Greens movement or the anti-nuclear movement. So it's not entirely new, I would argue, but I agree with Paul that the way in which the scale, the sophistication is certainly of it's a different beast now, right? So hence we also see that this has huge impact on elections. Whereas in the olden days, it was nibbling at the margins. Now it's at the center of politics, right? And it's no coincidence that the conspiracy world, there's this whole Breitbart and Alex Jones in the US, the kinds of conspiracy theories that are being dusted off are also old, right? They are coming, for example, the EU is suffering from conspiracy theories that this is really a Nazi project. It's really run by the dark forces. These were planted by the USSR as backers before the 1990s, when they wanted to kind of discredit Western Germany as still Nazi-run. Subsequently, the story became that the European Union was actually a secret ploy run by German Nazis. And right, there's of course other conspiracy theories according to which it is a socialism by stealth. And so the point I'm trying to make is that there's a bit more history to it than we might think in the first instance. Still, what Paul says is absolutely right. We are now, I would argue, in a different era where it's just become, it's really taken out the heart of democracy. And this is incredibly dangerous. And what I worry about particularly is the fact that we've seen the evidence. We've seen, for example, how Cambridge Analytica operated in the British context. We've seen how Breitbart now is, we now fully know the story, what happened with Breitbart. Yet there is a sense in which this was interesting to look at for a while, and we've kind of moved on, right? I think that's the danger here, that we delude ourselves in thinking that this was an episode. We're now aware it won't happen again. I completely disagree. I think we're still in the midst of it, right? There was a referendum. This is not about Trump anymore, but if you look at the Brexit folding story in the United Kingdom, there was a petition to government with people trying to get votes for a new referendum. Immediately within 24 hours, there's dark forces trying to plant false signatures in order to subsequently say, you see, this is dodgy and this is discredited. So we're really in the midst of this cyber war almost.
All right, I'm just going to come in, Frank, just because we are out of time. I wanted to give Paul, if you allow me, Frank, the final word. Paul, I wanted to come full circle back to Donald Trump himself just for a moment. And, as I said earlier, Trump has made it a point to keep repeating that this has been a witch hunt from day one, really. Do you think that in some ways that the media did go beyond red lines of some sort? Because now we're finding that, that even though Mueller has passed this judgment, that the American people now really believe that there was, at least half of them, 49%, I believe, according to the latest poll, believe that there was, in fact, some sort of collusion. So that sort of puts them at odds with somebody who actually investigated this deeply.
The no criminal bars from release. We haven't seen Mueller's conclusion, and it also says it didn't exonerate him on obstruction of justice. And the issue of collusion, if you want to use it as a circumstantial evidence, has been proven 100 times over. I would go the other way. I would say that the whole story of Donald Trump is the most gigantic media fail in history, because never mind politics, right? I've been on this since 2015 constantly, and it was easy, dead easy, to scour official sources, the FBI vault, the American press, going back 30 years, and you find a man who was cultivated by the Kremlin in the 1980s, who has a life of ties with organised crime, that has American banks, Western banks, with the exception of Deutsche Bank, who have been investigated, haven't touched for 30 years. How can you have a guy run to be leader of the free world and the media don't report that or emphasise that? And I think actually they're playing catch up. They're being played by a very sophisticated propagandists.
That's a very interesting point, and we're going to conclude on that point then, Paul. We, of course, appreciate your time and insight. That was Paul Krishnamurty, political analyst, speaking to us from Manchester, the UK, and we were, of course, also joined by Dr. Frank Moles, a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland. He had been speaking to us from Queensland in Australia as well. We appreciate his time and insight as well. Viewers, do stay with us, though. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back, viewers. British Prime Minister Theresa May has offered to resign if Parliament approves her Brexit deal in a third vote. Parliamentarians' attempt to take over the Brexit process failed, as the 8 proposals they put forward failed to receive a majority in indicative votes. With the country now in a stalemate, the question of how exactly the UK will leave the EU remains unanswered. To discuss that further, we're joined now by Mr. Joe Worthington, who is a political analyst, and he's joining us now from Exeter in the UK. Joe, thanks for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of this impasse we're at right now, Joe?
I think it's a difficult situation. Parliament opted to take back control of Brexit. They opted to vote on 8 different indicative votes, but yet they've paralysed themselves, and it's difficult to see what the next steps forward might be.
It's interesting that it isn't, Joe, because, you know, they've all been criticizing Theresa May in these days leading up to their takeover of this Brexit process, but yet they have not been able to solve that situation either. Do you think that sort of, sort of clears her of all the accusations and allegations that are being thrown her way of being incompetent in this process?
I think in some ways it does, because they haven't been able to solve what she couldn't solve. But on the other hand, Theresa May is the one that got Parliament into this mess in the first place, because she didn't consult all of the parties when she was debating with the EU.
And then what do you make of the EU stance in all this at the point then, Joe? Because right now we have obviously the EU looking at all this and saying, we can't offer anything more. Do you think that Theresa May then is right, that this deal is really the only deal, the deal that she has negotiated is the only deal that can really be passed?
From the EU's perspective, I think it is the only deal. The EU has, to their credit, been very consistent. They have always said, we are debating with one person, and that is Theresa May, and the British government has to get on board with what we both agree.
So then going forward then, if we look at the situation now, Joe, where we're at right now, the EU, I believe, has given till approximately June, or less than that, in fact, I believe, the 2-step process that they have presented vis-a-vis Brexit. Do you think that the UK will be leaving with a deal with the EU, or do you think that a no-deal scenario is that much more likely now?
I think a no-deal scenario is a lot more likely at the moment, but the lawmakers in the British Parliament have always said they will never agree to a no-deal Brexit, but yet they can't agree on what kind of Brexit they actually want. So who knows? It's a difficult situation that nobody in the British public understands. Very few analysts can figure this out. And to be honest, nobody in the Parliament knows what's going to happen.
All right, so let's talk then about a no-deal scenario, if we can. What would that mean for both the UK and the EU, in your opinion?
So a WTO, World Trade Organization Brexit, or a no-deal Brexit, or the hard Brexit, whatever name you want to give it, would mean that Britain trades with the EU according to World Trade Organization legislation. So some goods would be higher taxed, some would be lower taxed than they currently are. But the British government has said in a no-deal scenario, we would reduce tax levies on 80% of goods from the EU. So I think it would be a positive, actually, for the UK and the EU, because there would be less taxation, and it could be easier to trade with the UK.
What about the freedom of movement then? Because that's been an issue, hasn't it? Where a lot of Brexiteers have said, listen, we've had too many people coming over from Eastern Europe, for example, taking advantage of this free movement within the EU. What do you make of that?
So that would have to stop whatever Brexit happens, because that is one of the main reasons that people voted to leave the EU. That was one of the campaign promises of the official leave vote. But also a lot of Brexit MPs support greater freedoms of movement with the rest of the world, not based on geographical region. So a no-deal Brexit could be the solution to the freedom of movement question.
But then, many people then at the same, Joe, would say that, listen, because the UK has been part of the EU for so long, to leave the EU in such a drastic fashion, that would be like ripping the Band-Aid off, wouldn't it? And that would hurt, wouldn't it, in the short term?
There might be some short-term difficulties, but the British government has spent 2 years putting in place no-deal plans. The EU has spent the past year making sure that a no-deal scenario won't harm the EU as much as if we just dropped out tomorrow, which was the original date. But there will be difficulties. We just can't figure out what they might be at the moment.
Because, if we're looking at just business, for example, and you know about this, obviously, that there have been a number of banks and companies who have moved their headquarters out of London, for example. That must be worrying, isn't it, for the future?
It is worrying that businesses already in the UK are considering leaving, but we have businesses also moving here because of the liberalisation that could come from a clean Brexit or a hard Brexit or whatever you want to call it. For example, Boeing has invested in the UK, its biggest investment outside of the US over the past 2 years. They've invested in a big factory in Sheffield. And we have banks from other parts of the world outside of the EU opening offices in London and buying significant real estate in preparation for Brexit. So it's a two-sided coin.
And then, Joe, just as a question then, what do you make of the entire concern about the sort of racism, if I may even use that term, that came up during this Brexit campaign in the lead up to the referendum, and then even after, really? There have been concerns that a lot of this is being led by people who are intolerant, etc. Although that obviously is a very wide generalization, but do you think that that is a valid concern about the future then of UK society?
I don't think it is. I think Britain has a habit and an ability to heal the wounds that divide us. Britain isn't a racist country. Studies suggest that it isn't. But during the campaign, there was evidence of xenophobia, of racism on both sides. It wasn't just on the Leave side, but it will heal. It just needs both sides to come together.
All right, Joe, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, with your time and your insight and analysis, that was Joe Worthington speaking to us from Exeter in the UK. He's a political analyst. Now, viewers, as Joe there mentioned, as we've discussed, when it comes to these Brexit options, parliamentarians really took it upon themselves to try to solve this situation, saying that Theresa May was incompetent and couldn't handle the situation. But even they haven't been able to solve this impasse either, rejecting 8 proposals put forth to them. So really, the entire political establishment of the UK hasn't been able to resolve the situation of Brexit, even though the people apparently voted for this in that referendum a number of years ago. So we'll have to wait and see what happens next. Will there be a no-deal Brexit? Because that does seem ever more likely as a situation. And Joe there mentioned that for some people, they believe that might not be a bad thing, that the UK may be able to trade in a better fashion with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, really, if it were to separate from the EU through a hard deal Brexit. We'll keep a close eye on that situation here in Scope, but stay with us. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Thanks for staying with us, viewers. Now, a French organization representing the country's Muslims has sued Facebook and YouTube for allowing the live broadcast of the New Zealand terrorist attacks. New Zealand's Muslims have supported this accountability of social media giants. A long-standing issue, live videos and social media as a whole have been used by many hate groups, especially white supremacists, to further their cause. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Ms. Heena Khaled, who is a co-founder of AVOW, which is the Advancing Voices of Muslim Women Against Islamophobia. She's joining us via Skype from London. We're also joined by Dr. Sadek Hamid, who is an academic. He writes about Western Muslim communities, and he is joining us now via Skype from Manchester in the UK as well. Thank you both for joining us, Heena and Sadek. Heena, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of this lawsuit and holding these social media giants to account in this way?
Thank you for having me. I think that it's a bit disappointing, the fact that the Muslim community has to go out and file lawsuits when this is actually the job of government and social media platforms. Social media platforms have been so bad in self-regulation when it comes to Islamophobic content in comparison to racist and anti-Semitic content. Also, it's important to note, especially in the UK, when it came to ISIS and other Islamist type of extremism, the UK government worked with Google and other social media companies to ensure that, radical content, like content that was going to radicalize people and extremist content, was taken off. However, those same efforts are not afforded when it comes to Islamophobia, and the fact that the Muslim community has to take a lawsuit forward, it's a shame, because that means that the government and social media companies are probably sleeping on the job.
What then do you make of the fact that this conversation as a whole then about social media, at this point we know that Facebook has said that it will ban, just the latest news, that it will ban, in fact, praise and support for white nationalism and separatism, etc., on its platforms, i.e. Facebook and Instagram. That sort of conversation, though, about free speech, as I'd put to Sadek, what do you make of that? Do you think that banning any conversation is a healthy way forward either? Because I wonder if that just brings everything behind the veil where it would still continue.
So the difference is that this is the problem. Freedom of bigotry has been allowed to speak under the name of freedom of speech. And that is the problem. Islamophobia and what happened in Christchurch is not a new phenomena. In 2017, Darren Osborne ran a van into people coming out of the masjid after Tarawih and killed one person and injured many. Every day is a trauma for the Muslim community across the Western world when it comes to leaving your house if you're wearing a headscarf and your headscarf will be pulled off. Why? Because it's all the bigoted content online that is radicalizing people. There's such a proliferation of far-right content online. If me and you were to sit together and go and report Islamophobic content, which we would see as consequential to us, a negative consequence to us, to our community, a lot of it would turn out to be, the response would be that this does not violate community standards. And this is the problem, is social media platforms are not trained very well when it comes to understanding what Islamophobic content is. But the reverberations of that content is not on our community. All these far-right nationalists have all taken their radicalization, have all been radicalized online, on social media mainly, because that, concept of free speech, which I call free bigotry, has been allowed to spew online. I welcome Facebook's decision now. But for me personally, I just find it a little too late, because the heightened, 1 week after Christchurch, there was a nearly 600% increase in Islamophobic attacks in the UK alone.
Yeah.
There was a mosque attack in California making reference. In the UK, 80% of that rise of reported Islamophobic incidents were referring to New Zealand attacks.
Yeah.
So people are becoming emboldened. And I think it's too late, because there are so many platforms out there. There are so many. The internet is a free world, a free space. People create their own website.
All right, so Sadek, as Heena there mentioned, and as I'd put to her as well, this conversation about free speech, social media giants saying that it's not necessarily, or they have in the past at least, said it's not necessarily their job to police these platforms, that they provide for honest conversations. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's easy to play the free speech card, but there are implications and limitations to free speech. There is no absolute free speech, and certainly when any kind of group is promoting hate, intolerance, and inciting violence, I think the companies have a responsibility to manage that, because it has real-world implications. It's not just about having a conversation on social media. And these companies are very well aware of that. I think there is a reluctance to act because it's clearly obvious they have a monetary benefit from allowing these groups to post and to maintain their videos on Facebook and YouTube, because they get a financial gain out of it. So I think, people aren't fooled about this. And the point was already made by Heena around the double standards when, Muslim extremist groups post their material, it is quickly removed, whereas there is a lack of action and a dragging of the heels when it comes to white nationalist and extremist groups. I mean, even after Christchurch, we had even up to 2-3 days ago, we had hate groups posting their material on Facebook. So I mean, I think it raises some very difficult questions.
Yeah, so then Heena, the difficult questions, and one of them that I think is up is that, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Heena, as well, as many of us have who've lived in the West, is that Muslims are not open to criticism. They're not open to honest conversations back and forth, etc., debates even about Muslim political issues or even religious issues. Is that a fair point, do you think, that's at points that we're becoming too sensitive?
With that point for many years, but I think the Muslim community, we have to give them some credit, because we are we're one of the few communities that actually tend to look a lot of interest. We look very internally. We have a lot of conflict, within us. We have a lot of differences within us, and we're working very, very hard to unpack those issues. And I think there is a generational gap as well, and the younger generation, like my generation, are working very hard to unpack those issues. But I think it's still the same. I think this is kind of like a roof. It's like used against us. So one thing is criticizing the concept of religion, and doing it in a very constructive manner. One thing is spreading fake news, and also one needs to look at the consequences of it. People saying that it's fair to criticize the religion. The risk of it is that people are being killed outside, people are being attacked outside, and I think human life is a bit more important than that. We're still radicalizing an entire generation of people. People are very disenfranchised, people are very disunited. And I think these things need to come into play when you're talking about, but we can criticize the religion and you have community issues. Every community has issues. Every community is up for criticism. Yeah. And unfortunately, this is the only excuse that's used to justify and legitimize Islamophobia.
Sadek, what do you make of that conversation? Because interesting, on one hand, for example, as I put to Heena, the argument is that Muslims are too sensitive, but on the other hand, you mentioned Muslim extremist groups, and so did Heena, and their groups or posts being banned on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, but even pro-Palestinian groups, for example, if I'm bringing politics directly into this, Sadek, many pro-Palestinian groups have found themselves banned on many of these platforms as well. So one questions then what gives in this entire situation?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, that is a clear difference in treatment, and Facebook and YouTube and these social media giants are not playing fair. They're not being consistent in the treatment of its users, and I think it points to a broader structural anti-Muslim prejudice or Islamophobia which is operating at a global level. Unfortunately, I mean, it is a bias which is deeply rooted in Western societies, and it manifests at many different levels. And politics, the media organizations, the way, I mean, we have in the UK at the moment an ongoing a debate about the ruling government party, the Conservative Party, refusing to endorse a very widely accepted definition of Islamophobia. I mean, it's an agreement that's been cross-party, and all the other major political parties have endorsed this definition of Islamophobia being a problem and that it must be tackled. But very tellingly, our government at the moment refuses to endorse it. And within its party, there are almost daily cases of conservative politicians vocalizing anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-black sentiment, racism pure and simple. And so, it really does point to a widespread bias against Muslims, and that in itself is dangerous, because what it does is, for some impressionable young people, it actually then pushes them towards those extremists who are saying that all of the West is against Muslims, and there is a battle, the West versus Islam, and so on and so forth. And these narratives become self-perpetuating. So indirectly, what the social media companies are helping extremists to recruit, both in terms of allowing this material to stay on their platform, but also in the double standards in which they operate.
Heena, one of the things that came up after the New Zealand terror attacks was that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister there, has been praised a lot for immediately calling this terrorism. And in the aftermath, all we've really seen yet, apart from the public gestures, is a gun ban, essentially. And this is something very similar to what had happened in Canada too. After the Quebec mosque shooting, we had Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, there also standing in solidarity with Muslims, but nothing really real world wise happened vis-a-vis policies on the part of the government. Do you think that even for liberal politicians to be seen siding with Muslims too much, or actually putting forth policies, is almost like political suicide, do you think, at this point?
Absolutely. And I just want to, go back to what you asked Sadek and bring it back into this conversation. That it's not just pro-Palestinian groups that are being banned. There's a big bias against Muslim activism and politics. For example, people's Facebooks have been closed down for sharing pictures of Burhan Wani from Kashmir. And so it extends beyond, there's this kind of culture of considering politically active Muslims as extremists. And I felt those reverberations as well, where politicians, because I'm a Muslim activist challenging Islamophobia, I have liberal MPs not willing to stand and work with me. Primarily because I look at it unsavory, because we call out the state, and those kind of Muslims who tend to be engaged with politics tend to be those who say yes, they're politicians. And so what you're saying is very relevant. Is that there is this bias against Muslims, especially politically astute Muslims, who understand why the state needs to be challenged, how the state needs to be challenged. So us calling this, and this is the denial in the Conservative, the leading party in the UK, of Islamophobia. Our Prime Minister did not even mention the word Muslim or Islamophobia in her address after Christchurch. She said, hate is bad and whatever, but she refused to use the word Muslims and Islamophobia. But this extends to liberal, there are liberal MPs and councillors and politicians who will hold vigils in solidarity, but when it comes to them and their own bias and calling it out, they only engage with certain Muslims, and those kind of Muslims will not hold them to account. And this is the same thing as, and when it comes to Jacinda Ardern, I feel very uncomfortable with the entire media furore over how great she was, etc. And she did do a good job. Kudos to her for responding in the most humane way when it comes to being a leader of a country. She is at this point in time, she's an example to world leaders, and she should be seen as that way. Yes. However, for Muslims, let's not forget her voting record. Let's not forget her country's involvement when it comes to Syria and the war in Iraq and those kind of things as well. So you have to be very consistent. And this is, we have to have these open discussions about consistency as well.
Okay, we'll leave that as a final word. Of course, we appreciate both of your insights, your time, of course, and analysis as well. That was Ms. Heena Khaled, co-founder of the Advancing Voices of Muslim Women Against Islamophobia, AVOW, and she was speaking to us from London via Skype. We were also joined by Dr. Sadek Hamid, who is an academic. He writes about Western Muslim communities. He was speaking to us via Skype originally from Manchester and then on the line from Manchester in the UK. We appreciate his time as well. Now, viewers, as both of our guests spoke about this issue of consistency, as their mention at the end is an important one, because Muslims are not just imagining that Islamophobia is allowed to foster, I should say, on social media. It's been allowed to foster on social media, and it is high time that the social media giants such as Facebook, such as Instagram, Twitter, etc., do something about that, because other hate speech is not allowed. Other such forms of extremism is not allowed. And as Sadek there mentioned, this has real world consequences. The Christchurch attacks were directly in some ways linked to social media, and the fact that he was able to broadcast this attack live on Facebook for at least 17 minutes, according to most reports, and many people watched that video, a video game style video, mind you. So there are a lot of concerns that there remain. Facebook right now saying it bans white nationalism and such speech and posts. We'll have to wait and see, though, how that plays out, again, vis-a-vis Facebook's policies in the coming days. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope, but I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.